Welcome to Joy Talk Radio.
Welcome to Joy Talk Radio.
Welcome to Joy Talk Radio,
Where we come together to change the world
by challenging ourselves,
our beliefs,
and our systems
to get better results for generations to come.
If you recall, I used the term radicalized acute distress. Means that at the point of 911 and at the point of arrest, it's like compressed shock, it's compressed emotional trauma, it's under distress and duress. They've never been here before. They don't know the language, they don't know what happens to them, they're completely bewildered. At the point that they go into the jail, they've heard about this because 1/3 of adult Americans in this country have been jailed at some point. They've been arrested. That's a huge number of people. So they've heard about going to jail. It's talked about on, TV shows and all this stuff. This is talked about fairly often. So they know that they're going to deal with corrections to officers, and they know that they're walking into angry, hostile conditions. But at this point, they're released from police custody and put into a corrections deputy situation. They're fingerprinted. Everything they have is taken away from them. They may be body cavity searched or patted down. So they're humiliated and they feel deep misery. And the internal feelings that can happen to them are they feel suffocated and panicked, powerless and numb. They lost control over their life. They're scared and caged. They feel priced and sold because suddenly all of this money starts to pile up, and they know it's going to pile up because their car may have been towed. They're being UA'd, they're being tested. All these things are starting to add up. They feel persecuted. They feel discombobulated, defensive, defiant. Maybe at this point they can feel restlessness and they can't get away. Degraded. You can have deep psychological withdrawals. Deep depression. They feel vulnerable and distrusted and distrustful. They can start at this point going to self-annihilation and self-blame and beating yourself up, calling what a stupid person, how could I possibly have done that? All of those things can happen, and self-mutilation can happen. They feel despair and defenseless and miserable, deep, deep, deep miserable. Hopelessness, acute terror. They don't want to be locked up. They're terrified of going inside that jail, and it's cold and it's dark and it's scary and it's noisy, and there's other miserable people inside and they know it. And they don't know what to do, and they don't know anything about this. They're going into a completely foreign territory they've never been in before, and it doesn't smell good and it doesn't sound good, and they're terrified. And there's absolutely no music, no happy place, no consolation, no one telling them it's going to be okay. So comfort doesn't exist. So now they've walked into the jail, and now they're living inside the jail. And remember, all of this has happened in the first 24 to 72 hours. I mean, this is compressed trauma. So at the point that they go into the jail and they're waiting to be judged, they are experiencing these hostile conditions that they're living in, that I haven't even talked about what happens, that they're terrified of the inmates, the other inmates. They're having to witness people who are in deep withdrawals. They're living with and being housed with people who may be crazy and may be yelling and may be angry, and they're witnessing people who are fighting with each other. They're being thrown into a tank with a half a dozen or a dozen other people, and they've got one toilet, and you have to go to the bathroom in the public with these other people in the room with you. And you're sitting on metal benches, and maybe you got one blanket, but there's people yelling at you. Maybe you get even beat up. There's all these things that happen that are violent around you, and it's a completely hostile situation that you've never been in before yourself, ever. So it's like taking you out of one ecosystem and throwing you into a different ecosystem, and you don't know the language, you don't know the street language, you don't know the jail language, you don't know your defense language, you don't know what you're guilty of, you don't know anything, and there's no one to talk to, and you again have been told, don't talk to anybody. Anything you say or do can be held against you. So they're isolated, abandoned. They doubt everyone around them. They feel broken and beaten. There's no drive. They're anxious and worried. They can go into deep inertia and they can't even move. They'll go into such paralysis they can't even move. And they're disassociating. They can't find their emotional center. They don't know how to think good. They can't focus. They're angry. They can become ferocious, or they go through an internal hell. Externally, there's no help for them. There's no answers. Their mind won't work. They can't think. They get no clues. They have no resources. They don't have a book that they can go read. They don't have access to the internet. They don't have access to a phone. They don't have access to anybody who can actually help them. And while oftentimes people will say, well, you do get answered, you get the right to an attorney. Well, maybe you do and maybe you don't. There are actually multiple people who had gone through this process who they really didn't get access to an attorney. And what people won't tell you, what often the story is that even if you get to call out in order to use the phone, if you know how to use it and if you can use it, you have to have a credit card in order to do it. The person who you're calling has to be willing to accept a credit card call from the jail. And so it's going to cost the person who you're calling to get help. It's going to cost them $10 to $15 to put money on their card. They have to know why they're calling you. They have to make a decision at that point, whether it might be $50 you want to put on the card or $100. The people who are the family members have no idea that you're even in jail yet. So there's all these things that happen, and there's the shame. And then the person on the other end of the phone will say, well, what are you in for? And you'll say, I don't know. When do you get out? I don't know. What can I do to help you? I don't know. It's desolation sound, man. I mean, people are terrified. So there's no network in the jail who are your friends. There's no friend in the jail that you know. You learn that you need to be submissive to the jailer. And if they decide to push you around or do whatever, I mean, you're not going to do anything. You can't do anything because you're in already deep trouble. Nothing is logical. The sense of surreality, it's like what really I discovered happens is people will have almost like a split brain experience where there's one reality that says, I know that in America, I'm free. I know that I'm innocent until proven guilty. I know that I can be trusted. I know that everything my parents and all the cops and all the 911 people tell me is true. That's what I thought an hour ago or a day ago. And suddenly there is nothing that is true about any of that. And so what happens is they experience this split in reality from I'm in some strange place and it couldn't be true. And yet it is true because you can smell it, you can taste it, you can see it, you can hear it, you can feel it. And you know that you're in this deep place of sadness and sorrow. So in that place, when you can either become angry and fight with other people. Well, if you do that, you're going to have more charges filed against you. If you don't fight with other people, you're going to be abused. If you just go into inertia, you can be abused. So you don't know what to do. No one to listen, no one to forgive, no relief from guilt, shame, blame. There's no one to turn, nowhere to turn, and you're simply prey. You're prey to everything from your own fears to theirs. And physically, you are vulnerable. So now you get to be judged and you get walked into a courtroom. And when you walk into the courtroom, there are all of these people in suits walking around, acting busy, laughing about vacations and travel and, what did they do yesterday? And there's cops or jailers who are there. And suddenly you may have been walked into the room with, handcuffs on. Depends on where your arraignment is and what happened. There are people watching you who are out there who are all speculating about what happened to you. You don't even know what to say. Now you get to find out. The judge will read, or the prosecutor will read the charges. So now you find out what the charges are. You may have been introduced to a public defender. That public defender may have talked to you for 30 seconds before they are supposed to go up and represent you and plead, talk about what kind of bail you're going to get, whether you should get out or not get out. everything happens and you're like in this surreal reality. You don't even know the language. You don't even know what happened. You don't know how much bail is, who's going to put bail up for you, and where are they going to come up with $500 or $1,000 or $5,000. How's that going to happen? You didn't even get to talk to anybody yet. So suddenly 72 hours in, you've caused all this distress. You felt all the shock trauma, and this repetitive accelerating trauma is what I call it. It just keeps hammering at you. And for 24 to 72 hours, you've gone through all that. And my experience in talking to these people is that, and I'm not a medical professional, I have to say that. I don't have a background in this. All I can tell you is what people said to me. And in compiling it all together, I realized that what really happens is the psyche blades, they just disconnect. They don't know what to do. They don't know what to say. They can't think straight. And by the time they talk to the judge and they talk in the courtroom, the courtrooms, the judges, the people who are actually processing people through, they say, well, they can't even think straight. They don't even know what's going on. And they assume that these people were mentally ill or broken or traumatized before they got into the car accident, before anything happened. They thought that that's a pre-existing condition, and that's why they got in trouble, and that's why they committed a crime, and it's their fault. So something's wrong with these people. And I understand that prejudgment, because you know what? Had you or I gone through all this stuff ahead of time, and then you have to sit here and try to talk to a judge about whatever happened and make a decision and be rational, I mean, you can't even relate to it. So the psyche has so split and disconnected that what happens is that people go into self-defense and they can't even talk. And that's why when they come out of that jail and you talk to them and they go, I don't want to talk about it, they can't talk about it. They can't even speak about it. So what I did after I listened to all these people talk, I went, wow, this is so, I mean, it was really distressing to me to even talk to them about it, let alone be the person who went through it. And all of this is the stuff that happens again before bail. What I learned is that by the time people finished talking to me, that at the point of the bail hearing and at the point of either having to spend more time in jail or get out and have to deal with the attorneys and the defense and all the rest of the language, people are incurring between $10,000 and $30,000 in costs, immediate costs, at the point of the accusation. They're supposed to be innocent until proven guilty. They get a public defender. One of the biggest complaints that I got is there's no one to defend them for what they did. The public defender runs the paper process for them. They file the right papers. They tell them what their plea agreement's going to do. They negotiate. They become the broker-dealer who negotiates for these people to try to get out of jail. And by the time people get to the point of negotiation, believe me, they'll do almost anything to get out of that jail. So the psyche breaks. And at that point, I sat back and I went, how do I describe this? Who knows about this? I've never heard anyone talk about this. In 9 years of talking to people inside the system, trying to fix the system, trying to talk about the system, no one could explain to me. People would talk about having, these people had PTSD, or they'd have, they'd had split personalities. They would talk about all these deep psychosis conditions. But they were talking about them as if it was the condition that caused the arrest, which put them in jail. So they were criminals. And how long did you have to keep them there because they had caused some problem, because they had an anger episode, or because they were mentally ill. So the whole conversation was, these people committed a crime, therefore, and the crime was caused because they were all psychotic or crazy, they weren't tracking straight. So what are we going to do with them? It's like, it was all post-arrest, was pre-judged and pre-guilty. And I was just shocked. So I went online and I started looking for answers. I started to look for, who was talking about all this stuff that happened here, the radicalized acute distress under duress that I saw in the beginning before they were arrested, and then how that became repetitive accelerating trauma that just compounded, got bigger and bigger and bigger to the point where people couldn't even talk. So I went and looked it up. And what I found was that the World Health Organization did have a definition for this kind of conditions that I was witnessing. And the condition, they called it complex post-traumatic stress disorder. And the symptoms were the kinds of symptoms that you would find in somebody who had gotten out of a cult or had been taken hostage in a country, or a person who was held captive in a peaceful country, like they were suddenly a prisoner, a political prisoner, or someone who had been raped and held hostage, somebody who had been held captive in a condition where they never knew they were at war. It was a very different kind of problem than the typical post-traumatic stress or the combat stress or the people who had been prisoners of war. There were similarities, but this had a little bit of a different take. And the thing that I realized in reading the side effects and understanding the problem is that before the 911 call, I realized that out of all of the 79 people I was talking to, none of them intended to commit a crime. None of them. I mean, I didn't know this because I just presumed, like everybody else, that they must have committed a crime. They must have intended it. They must have done this or that. No, out of all these 79 people I talked to, they didn't intend to commit a crime. They got in an accident. They made a mistake. They got too drunk. They got angry. They had a divorce and they yelled at somebody. They yelled at their father, and the neighbor called the cops because they were afraid that somebody was going to get mad. They may have thrown a phone at somebody because they were really upset. They may have, there was they had a medication problem. There was a family beef. They were maybe living homeless on the streets, and, these things happened to them. And from that call, suddenly they're in this deep state, and the biggest problem was that they suddenly were betrayed by the people who were their protectors. America, we are conditioned from the point of youth, from when we first start talking about America, freedom. Freedom is our highest value. 911, you called them to get help. Everyone, for the last, I don't know, my entire generational life, you ever have a problem, call 911, they'll come help you. And it used to be true that we were taught that if you needed help, you did call 911 because the firemen came. If you called 911, even back then, 20, 30 years ago, the police would come and they'd help pull you out of the ditch. They might take you home to your mom and dad to get you fixed. They didn't automatically write you tickets. They didn't automatically haul you off to jail. Those things started to happen in the last 10 to 20 years. And I realized that one of the things that changed in our technology world was that we moved to a 911 system, and the recordings would go not just to fire, they would also go to the police departments. And because of 9/11 happening, 9/11 changed the game for terror, changed the game for police. It changed the game for the automatic responders. It changed the game for everybody. And we went from people being compassionate and helpful in attitude to a lot of a situation where people were afraid of liability. And so as a result of that particular change in our technology attitude, it actually changed the game for all these people who had been arrested. And when I realized that, I went, oh my God, that's why this issue with captivity is such a big deal. Because all of these people assumed that they were going to be taken care of, helped. They never intended to commit a crime. They never intended to be bad. They never intended to go to jail. They didn't expect those things to happen. What they expected was innocent until proven guilty. They expected to get help. They expected someone to listen to them. They expected to be heard. They expected somebody to actually listen to the witnesses who were on their side of the story. And typically, that often doesn't happen in that 24 to 72 hours. It doesn't happen in that first couple hours at the incident. There's a lot of things happening. So no one interviews them. No one finds out what's wrong. Nobody does the research. The investigations happen, but the investigations happen against your family. The investigations happen to see if they can prove that you committed the crime. The investigations happen to see if you've got a blood alcohol thing. or if you actually did hit somebody, no one talks about what happened before this happened. And were there any extenuating circumstances? And who goes to interview the witnesses to try to get you innocent? I talked to some of these people, didn't have witnesses interviewed for a year. They ended up in the system and no one had interviewed the witnesses for a year. I was stunned. I was completely stunned. How does this happen? But because the people who were accused and arrested, they didn't even know how to think about it. They didn't know how to talk about it. They didn't have $10,000 to $20,000 or $30,000 to go hire their own defense attorney who actually was looking to find out why they shouldn't be charged, why they should be innocent. Most of these people had to take and accept a public defender because many of them didn't have the money. But even the ones who were millionaires who could have paid and in cases did pay, they weren't defended either. And I didn't understand that just because you're wealthy, that's another big blind spot. We're taught that if you have money, you can get out, you get free. That's not true at all. Sometimes you lose even more because guess what? Simply because you got arrested, you've got businesses and jobs that you just lost. You've got employees that get in trouble. You've got credit card failures that happen. You may lose your license, your professional licenses. Your insurance rates go up. All of these things happen to you. Your bank account gets in trouble. All these things happen to you that people who are poor, you don't have to worry about whether or not your credit went down. It was toast before. You don't have to worry whether your insurance rates, your premium and your quality and your licenses got lost. They're already gone. So there's a whole different conversation that happens to people who are wealthy that I had not heard in 9 years of studying the jail industrial complex and what happened to people. Never heard it. Never heard it. I had never heard what happens to people who go to the mental health ward, who get arrested and taken to the county and jailed inside the hospital, in effect, restrained inside the hospital. I didn't know that if you go into the jail and you are mentally ill and you get scared and the police try to restrain you and you spit at them or you push back or you yell at them, that you can be charged with a felony. We had one young man that ended up in there. He was terrified. He had a mental health problem. They knew he had a mental health diagnosis. They took him into the jail, and before he got out on his arraignment and got bailed out, they had already stacked 3 felony charges against him. So the disconnect between what you think is going to happen to you in America and what actually happens to you is so big that the conditions that I'm talking about, where the psyche splits, where you're totally disconnected. One reality does not match another one and you can't get through it. Well, when I read the descriptions, and by the way, the United States and the American Medical Association, we don't have a diagnosis of complex post-traumatic stress disorder. We don't have anything like that. It was the World Health Organization where I got this definition. So let me talk about what the annihilated. They feel annihilated, and there's a systemic breakdown in their body. It's almost like they went into a form of shock. When you get in a car accident, your body can go into shock. Your lymphatic system shuts down. You get inflammatory. You can die from physical shock. Well, these are people who they may have had physical shock. They have mental shock. They have spiritual shock. They have psychosomatic shock. They've experienced all this shock, and their system doesn't work right. So they've lost their tribe and their identity. These are side effects that can happen with complex post-traumatic stress disorder. Now, when they talked about it, this is a disorder that's diagnosed. I'm talking about it as the symptoms that I witnessed that were similar to what I saw just from this. They weren't diagnosed with it. I just witnessed them happening this. They've lost their beliefs. They've lost trust in everything. They got cast out. They're shunned and ostracized. They feel aimless, lost. Their soul has been shattered. They have a broken brain conditions. They can't think straight. They can't process anything logically. They feel futile. Some people feel dead, like they can't. They're just a dead brain. Out of body experiencing. They'll start hallucinating. They're unable to organize, or they can't function right at all. They can't even track a conversation. They'll say one thing and then they'll be over here and they'll be scattered and talk about something completely differently. They're unstable emotionally. They'll go from being, talking to you, and then you say something or you move just wrong, and all of a sudden they'll start yelling at you like you're the bad guy. You may even be the person who's helping them. It reminded me of the time when, I tried to help an animal that got hit on the highway, and I was trying to help him and they bit me, and that's an automatic response. But if you do that and you're inside the jail or inside the situation, that's going to be a felony charge. And you don't know that because you're disconnected. You're just acting as an animal in a response. And it's not because you are an animal bad criminal. It's because you're terrified and somebody just hurt you. So they'll have delusions, paranoia, rage. Those are the kinds of things happen on the inside. And the symptoms that you end up labeled with, and this oftentimes I heard it in the courtroom, they'd have a post-traumatic stress disorder of some kind. They'd have behavioral attachment disorders. They'd call it Stockholm Syndrome, serious psychological distress, SPD, developmental trauma disorder, conduct disorder, combat stress disorder, obsessive compulsive disorder, oppositional defiant disorder, co-occurring substance abuse disorder, panic attacks, anxiety attacks, DSM-5, which is dysregulation disorders, personality disorders, emotional triggering, unmitigated stress. The biggest thing is they end up becoming, because they're so disconnected and they have nothing to attach their psyche to that they know, they become subject to gangs, cults, and emotional takeover. And then they're damaged. So let me correct something. I said DSM-5 and dysregulation disorders. DSM-5 is a book that you can go into and you can start looking at all the disorders and the illnesses that can affect people mentally. But the dysregulation, the cognitive dissonance, the inability to make sense out of anything, it really does happen that the psyche breaks and people become prey to medical. Heck, some of these people, because they get called crazy, the medical doctors then come in and give them meds. And now suddenly you've got a person who's dealing with emotional distress and trauma. He's already inflamed. He's already not making sense. And now they're putting drugs in him to cause chemical reactions. And then people have reactions to the drugs, and then they have reactions to the reactions. And, it just gets worse and worse and worse. So the emotional terrorism that happens from this radicalized acute distress under duress, I call it RADD, R-A-D-D, plus the repetitive accelerating trauma, which is RAT, these are the symptoms that happen before even the total psyche breaks and we end up with this complex post-traumatic disorder type symptoms. So I want to be clear that those are the things that happen, and it was my assessment and my observation that it appears that these things are because of this extreme emotional psychological trauma. Now, one of the other things I want to talk about here is not only did they expect themselves to be safe, they also believe that freedom is sacred. The sacredness of that trust of freedom, that's taught to us since we're little tiny children. We hear it in the news. We pledge allegiance to the flag. We're told that freedom is the one thing you don't take away from anybody unless you are a criminal, and you must go away. And then we're also taught that criminals are violent and mean and vicious people. So anybody who is a criminal is really a bad person. So now what happens is you've got this person who came in, and now they're labeled a criminal and talked as if they're a criminal. They've been treated as a criminal, everything. So now suddenly they have another cognitive dissonance where they've been told they're a criminal and they never intended to cause any harm to anyone. It's an unfortunate. So the heartbreak, the betrayal, the emotional betrayal and heartbreak, the cellular distress that people experience in that first 24 to 72 hours before they even went to court is so huge. So the shaming, and they think that they're living in a civilized society. They thought that they could trust authority. They thought they had some rights. They thought they could believe in fairness and honor. They thought they had a right to an actual defense, that somebody would stand up and protect them and help them, that they were entitled to police protection. So suddenly the betrayal is not just they didn't get protected by the police, and they didn't get protected by the fire people, and they didn't get protected by anybody. Not only that, they got preyed upon, arrested, possibly pushed around, locked up and jailed by the people who were supposed to be there to protect them. The people who they paid taxes to, the people who they trust and who they passed all these laws to help keep them safe from real criminals and people who do violent things. And suddenly, the right to remain silent is not an asset. You find out that the right to remain silent is actually purgatory. Because if you do speak, you're going to get in trouble. If you speak to the wrong people, you're going to get in trouble. And not only that, you can't talk about all the things that happened to you. So all the things that can give you emotional relief are denied you. And if you cry or you act bad or you get angry or you get upset, which are all normal outlets for people who are under deep trauma, you get more felonies. You get more punishment. You get put in isolation. You get mistreated. You get beat up. You get told that you're a bad actor. You get told that you're crazy. So this nightmare of things that happen at the point of a 911 call into an arrest is horrible. Not only that, okay, so it gets worse. Not only that, these folks are terrified. Most of us, I mean, think about it. Are you afraid to go into jail? I am. Do I want to be hanging around in four walls, in concrete, out of daylight, unable to get my own food and water and go to the bathroom safely without having to do it in public? Do I want to do that? Nobody wants to do that. We have years of fear of living in dungeons. Our bodies, remember, are hybrids. Our ancient family, our ancestors, there's an emotional knowledge that we carry from ancestral heritage that comes up, that's been proven, that we have emotional memories of things like this. So we are terrified of going into a jail. We're afraid of the other criminals in there. We know that criminals are dangerous, that criminals are cruel and hurt you. We've been taught that torture only happens in war. It never happens to me, not in my backyard. I mean, I never expected to be called a criminal or to go to jail. And furthermore, I've been taught as a little kid, you don't associate with anybody who's ever been into jail. You don't associate. You're judged by the people you keep, by the friends you keep. Suddenly now you're living inside a jail with are you kidding? Now I have been condemned by my own social ostracism. And to suddenly be called a criminal is traumatizing. So in the space of 24 to 72 hours, people who go into the system become prey to psychological injuries, emotional dysfunction, interpersonal trauma, community violence, interpersonal abuse, and marketplace terrorism, and custodial care violence. So that's one side of my chart, and it's what happens as the mind switches from freedom to captive. People break down. And that's the first side of this research that I did. And in a second, I'll take a break. I'm going to come back and talk about what happens to the family.
Thank you for joining us on Joy Talk Radio.